Welcome back. We have spent all summer looking forward to welcoming you and your students back to Falls Church City Public Schools. I'm Tricia Minson. I'm the attorney for the superintendent, Dr. Noonan, and the school board. I work out of central office, and I'm thrilled to be part of the team that supports your students and you. I'm not in schools often, but behind the scenes, I make sure that we're fully compliant with all state and federal laws. I assist with the drafting of policies, and I help address legal concerns as they arise. This is my third year with FCCPS and my 11th year as an education attorney. This video that you're watching is on Safe Schools. It's a program that we're in our third year of using. It allows us to make sure that all staff receives all of the mandated training, and it allows us to train staff who's hired mid-year so that everybody receives the same information, the same training. Our Director of Human Resources, Amy Hall, will be assigning each staff member with the relevant and appropriate trainings. All staff will be viewing the training on mandatory reporting, on the FCCPS Employee Handbook, on health emergencies and bloodborne pathogens. There's also specialized training. All staff that works with students will be receiving the FERPA training. Any staff working with a diabetic student will receive diabetes training. And then there's also training on medical administration for epinephrine, glucagon, and Diastat. If you have any questions about the trainings that you've been assigned, please reach out to Ms. Hall at HR. If you have trainings about this training that I'm providing on legal compliance, I'd ask that you talk to your direct supervisor, your director, or your principal with any questions. Also, during the school year, if you have any questions that you think are legal or questions about our policies, I'd ask that you channel those questions through to your director or your principal, and they'll pass them along to me. Thank you. Today's training is going to cover much of what I covered in my video last year: mandatory reporting, FCCPS's policies, FERPA, FOIA, bullying and harassment, professional ethics, custody tips, and safety. Even though there's a separate video for mandatory reporting and for FERPA on Safe Schools, I felt it was important for me to discuss it here, particularly because we want you to know what the Virginia requirements are and what our expectation is of you as an employee of the Falls Church City School Board. The slide now talks about mandatory reporting. This is the direct language from the Code of Virginia that says every school board employee who in his or her professional or official capacity has reason to believe that a student is abused or neglected must immediately report the matter to either the local Department of Social Services, the Virginia Toll-Free Department of Social Services, or to the person in charge of the school or the department. Our expectation of you as an FCCPS employee is that you immediately call Child Protective Services and then tell your administrator or your supervisor, or you call your administrator and your supervisor and they'll sit down together with you and make the call to CPS. You must report suspected cases of child abuse or neglect within 24 hours. This is covered in our policy JHG, which also appears at GAE, Child Abuse, Neglect, and Reporting. On to other policies. As of the past 2 years, the school board is in the process of moving from numbered older policies to lettered policies that we've received from the Virginia School Board Association, the VSBA, and the school board has tweaked many of those. A couple policies that I wanted to point out to you and want to make sure all staff knows about are the no harassment and discrimination of students or of staff. These are relatively new policies that the board adopted in October of this past school year. The policies on non-discrimination include policy AC, non-discrimination, and that makes clear that the school board is committed to non-discrimination with regard to sex, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, race, color, national origin, disability, religion, ancestry, age, marital status, genetic information, or any other characteristic protected by law. This policy AC is a general school board policy that states that this commitment to non-discrimination will prevail in all of our policies and practices for staff, students, educational programs and services, and individuals and entities with whom the school board does business. There are also more specialized policies, including policy GBA, JFHA, the prohibition of harassment and retaliation that applies to staff and students. Policy JB, equal educational opportunities and non-discrimination, that applies to students. Policy GB, non-discrimination and equal employment opportunities. And policy JBA, Section 504, non-discrimination policy and grievance procedures. All of those policies have an accompanying complaint form that's available on the policy page of our website and throughout our website, that if you or a community member or student has a concern, the complaint form would be a good place to start to fill that out to make sure there are no concerns. Another policy that's fairly new this year is policy GA, Personnel Policies Goals. This policy was adopted last year and then was amended recently in the summer. This policy states that current school board employees cannot assist a current or former employee, agent, or contractor in obtaining a job if that current school board employee has probable cause to believe the person they're assisting in getting the job has engaged in sexual misconduct regarding a minor or a student in violation of the law. The language of the policy does say has probable cause to believe. That language follows the Virginia Code, and that language also mirrors the federal code. Don't get caught up in the language of probable cause. That is legal language. Really what it's saying is if you see something, say something. If there's abuse of a child, we're required to report it. If you're concerned or something feels uncomfortable or doesn't feel right, report that to your supervisor, talk to another colleague, but make sure that we do what's right for our students and keep our students safe. This requirement from policy GA goes beyond mandatory reporting, which we absolutely must do, but also looks at what our core focus is this year. And for all of us, what should be our focus in our careers in education, which is to make sure that students are safe and secure and to promote a caring community and climate. We do not and we will not pass the trash. If a student's being harmed in our schools, we will call CPS, we'll call the police, or we'll call both of them. We do not want to hesitate to speak up if we see something that's wrong. Another policy I wanted to point out, since this year is a year that 3 school board members have seats in the election cycle, is Regulation 5.11.1. This regulation states that employees are encouraged to exercise their constitutional rights to participate in political activities, but they need to do so on their own time or by taking leave. Instructional employees may discuss political issues with students, but doing so needs to be part of the instructional program, and you need to follow FCCPS guidelines to ensure that there's a balanced and critical review of issues. The policy also goes on to state that employees may not participate and FCCPS facilities may not be used in political campaigns during school or work hours. This includes wearing campaign buttons or t-shirts or hats or other items that are designed to influence the outcome of an election, and we can't display those items in the workplace. Those are just some high-level policies I wanted to point out to everyone this year, but I do want to let you know that policies are often the first place that I look when I get a question from Dr. Noonan or from a director or from a principal. So you can find our policies on our website, fccps.org, under School Board and under Policies. Another item I wanted to briefly touch on, although I know it's assigned to all staff members through Safe Schools, is the Employee Handbook. The Employee Handbook provides important information and guidance. It's where to look if you have questions about what our expectations are of staff. All employees must review the handbook on Safe Schools and click the box acknowledging that you have read it. It has been updated this year to update our new policies and make sure we're fully in compliance. One item in there that I did want to point out to everyone is that you should not be using private accounts, whether that's private email, your personal cell phone, or social media, to communicate with our students and with our families. You should only be using your FCCPS email in Schoology, which I will touch on later, for all of your communications with staff and with students and with parents. And please know that the email that you've been given by FCCPS and your access to the Schoology account are not private. Those are things that we do have access to, and we should, to make sure that the information being shared with our families and our students is appropriate. The next topic is FERPA, which stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is a federal law that protects the privacies of students' educational records. FERPA gives parents certain rights with respect to their students' educational records, including the right to inspect and review the students' educational records that are maintained by the school. Generally, schools must have written permission from parents in order to release any information that's included in a student's educational record. A few pointers on FERPA. A request to see a student's educational record does not need to be made in writing. If a parent says they want to see a student's file, we show the parent the student's file. We often make them a copy. That copy must be provided to the parents within 45 calendar days of the request. The file will be compiled by the school, and sometimes I'll review the file if there's a concern that there might be confidential information, such as reference to other students in a student's file. We would redact the names of other students, because that's part of the other student's educational record that doesn't need and cannot be shared without the permission of those parents. If you use a student's initials in emails or other correspondence, that does not exempt the email or correspondence from FERPA. It just makes it harder for us to comply with the FERPA request. So don't feel like you need to use students' initials in an email. You can go ahead and use a student's name. Emails, as I've been talking about, are subject to production under FERPA. So if you're sending emails back and forth about a student's educational program or a student's progress or how a student interacted in school or disciplinary incident, that email would need to be produced under FERPA. So that brings up my next point, which is you need to be very careful including student information, any personally identifiable information, or PII, in email correspondence or any correspondence, because you're creating a record that then goes with the student from school to school. Personally identifiable information, or PII, includes anything that can be used to distinguish or trace a student, directly or indirectly when linked with other information. So if you're sending emails about one student, make sure you're not saying, wow, we did a great job on Trisha's IEP goals. Let's use those goals in John's IEP, because then you have my information connected with John's information. And I was helping compile a FERPA response this summer, and that did happen. So we had to redact the name of the student every single time, and there were multiple email replies to that. So it'll make life easier if you don't use other students' names or identifiable information when you're sending emails about one student. Another of my favorite F words is FOIA, which stands for the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. FOIA, the purpose of FOIA is to make sure that any entity that's conducting public business makes public records available to anyone who's a resident of the state, so anyone who lives in Virginia, has a Virginia address, or any media company transacting public business in the state. The definition of public records under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act is very broad. So the takeaway is if you are sending correspondence or putting together documents or working on a contract that relates to public business, which we're in the business of public school, we will need to be providing that document, that correspondence, those notes. Virginia FOIA is very expansive. It's often futile to defend or withhold information. So more disclosure is better. We will err on the side of disclosure. So if you're sending emails that relate to what we're doing, if you send emails that relate to the election, if you're sending correspondence that relates to how we do work at the schools, that could be subject to a production under FOIA. So a little bit more. FOIA request is a request for any document that is already existing. Whether or not someone says this is a FOIA request or, hey, I'd like documents that relate to the construction of the high school, we provide documents. They don't have to say the word FOIA for a request for a written document to be a FOIA request. Something that's not a FOIA request is a question. So if there's a question, we answer it, but we don't necessarily have to compile documents that provide the answer. We answer questions. If you get a request for records that relate to specific students, that would be a FERPA request, and we respond to that within 45 calendar days. If you get a request for documents, what you must do the very day that you receive the request is forward it to me at my FOIA email address, which is FOIA, F-O-I-A, @fccps.org. You have to forward it the same day because as a FOIA officer, I have 5 business days from receipt of the request for public records to provide the response. So it's important that if you get a request for records, you pass that along directly to me at FOIA@fccps.org so that we can fully comply and make public records available to the public. I've mentioned emails when I was talking about FERPA and when I was talking about FOIA, so I want to provide some email guidance to each of you today. Deleting an email doesn't mean that it goes away. So if you get an email and think, oh, I shouldn't have gotten this, do what you need to address that concern. Deleting it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist anymore. Where you sent an email, what the subject line is, what the topic is, does not define a record as a public record or a student record. It's what's included in the body of that email that will determine, is this relate to a student's education and therefore is it part of the student's educational record, or does this relate to public business? And if it does, then it is a public record. Your personal email and your personal device can be subject to a FERPA or a FOIA if you are transacting public business or talking about a student's educational record. So that is why we ask that you only use devices that we've provided to you and your FCCPS email and Schoology accounts for communication. Because if we get a FOIA request or if we get a FERPA request, we have access to those accounts. We can easily pull those, and we won't have to say, I need to see your personal cell phone to review text messages that you sent that relate to a student's education, or I need to review your personal email account because you sent emails that related to public business. So again, don't use your personal email to conduct school business. Don't use your school email to conduct personal or political business. And if there's something that you don't want on the front page of our local Falls Church News Press or on the front page of the Washington Post, then don't put something in an email. Not surprisingly, requests under FERPA or requests under FOIA go up around emotional events. For students and FERPA requests often come up prior to IEP meetings, or after a student has been recommended for suspension or expulsion, or during the budget time or during elections for FOIA requests. Both FOIA and FERPA requests can result in teacher-to-teacher emails being in the public hands or in parents' hands. So think before you send an email to a colleague. Is this something that could be public or that I would want the public to know that I'm sending? They also go around emotional events such as grades and exams. And while I mentioned grades and exams, I'd like to put in my special education plug because I was a special education attorney for 11 years prior to coming to the school division. This relates to special education, but also to all staff members who work directly with students. Students should not be failing our classes, and students should not be failing to make progress. If a student is not making progress, there needs to be a conversation with the student, a conversation with the parents. We need to pull in our specialists to see what other support we can provide. This is particularly true that students should not be failing to make progress if the student has an IEP or a 504 plan in place. We want to make sure that all of our students are learning and growing and having access to education. And if a student isn't making progress, we want to quickly address it and get intervention in place to provide support to our students. A few other details about FERPA versus FOIA. While FERPA prevents disclosure of some of your emails that relate directly to individual students, FOIA compels the disclosure of the rest of your emails, so long as they relate to your job here in FCCPS. While I've been talking a lot about emails, FERPA and FOIA and request for records apply equally to tweets and to blogs and to text messages. So if there's personally identifiable information of a student, that does make it an educational record. And if it is in the course of conducting public business, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or a blog or a text message, then it could be a public record that is subject to FOIA. With all that said, here are my 5 communication tips for you. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone. If there's an issue or a concern, walk down the hall and talk to a colleague, or pick up the phone and chat through, what are we going to do to support this student? Or did you see this? What are we going to do to address this change in curriculum? After you've had that conversation in person or on the phone, then it's great to summarize in writing what it is that was decided. That allows us to keep a log of communication and a log of what has transpired or what the recommended action is going forward without making the back and forth that we often use emails for subject to disclosure. Also, don't inadvertently create an educational record by including a student's name or other personally identifiable information in an email. That makes it very difficult to comply with a request under FERPA. Also, don't unnecessarily share records. Under FERPA, only individuals who should have access to a student's file are able to see a student's file. So don't share students' personal information with staff who's not working with that student. Finally, public records do not need to contain personally identifiable information to make it exempt. What I mean is if you're sending emails back and forth about a student's education, which is clearly an educational record, and then you get onto the topic of public business, that public business information would be subject to production under FOIA. We'd have to go back in response to FOIA and redact any of the student's personally identifiable information, but information or communication or contact or comments that were never meant to be shared with parents or colleagues might then be disclosed to parents or colleagues subject to a FOIA request. So don't use email to vent. If you're frustrated, I get that, but don't use our email, don't use personal email, don't use writings to communicate your grievances or your concerns if it's not something that you don't want others to see. I mentioned this earlier, but this is very crucial. We expect you to be communicating with students and with parents with the avenues that we have provided, with your FCCPS account, with your Schoology account, or with an account that your administrator has access to and has approved. This keeps you safe, this protects your students, and it protects you. It allows you to draw clear boundaries with parents of the ways to communicate with you and the ways that you will be available, and allows us to make sure that we're complying with the expectations to keep all of our students safe. This applies equally to folks who are sponsors of clubs and who are coaches. Coaches shouldn't be sending text messages, and club sponsors shouldn't be sending text messages to students or parents unless it's a part of a text email chain that a principal or supervisor, athletic director is also included on. So if it's easier for a coach to let everyone know that practice is canceled because of rain via text message, that correspondence should be sent directly to the entire group with the athletic director also included on that text, so that Julie Braven can know what's going on with her teams, and we have a way to keep track of correspondence that's sent back and forth with families and with students. If a student or a parent individually directly responds, you can receive that response, but we'd ask that you not reply, because we don't want to get in the business of sending individual text messages or messages directly to students or directly to parents, unless it relates only to that specific student and it's part of their educational program. A few communication tips. You should only be communicating with parents of a student and anyone who you have a specific release to talk to. So if a parent copies a lawyer on an email to a teacher or to a paraprofessional or an advocate or another family member, you should not reply all and include a response to an individual who we do not know. We have a release, which the administrators of your building will know, a release to share information with that outside person who is not a parent. If you get a call or an email from a lawyer, or if you get a subpoena, that's something that you should share with your principal or director and can be passed along to me. But just because you get a subpoena or just because you hear from a lawyer does not mean that you have authorization to speak to that lawyer to provide documents. So I'm always happy to get involved and to make sure that what we receive is legally compliant and that we need to correspond with lawyers. And really, I should be the one talking to lawyers. So if you get any concerns, it doesn't happen often, but I'm always happy to be involved. Now we're moving on to bullying and harassment. We want everyone at our schools, our staff, our volunteers, and particularly our students, to feel safe and to be supported. Everyone who's an employee of FCCPS has an affirmative duty to intervene, to report, and to prevent bullying and to prevent harassment. We're looking to our principals and to our directors to clarify the path in their building or in their department of how to report student incidents. And we want principals and administrators to be the ones who know what's going on at all times. So we'd ask that if there are concerns, you always report them back to your building administrator or to your director so they can track them and document them and follow up and keep track of concerns that come up in our schools and our departments. We also want to consider any educational impact that bullying and harassment might have on our students. This might mean that we need to reconvene a 504 team or an IEP team to make sure a student is continuing to make progress under those programs in the event that they are feeling bullied or harassed, or there has been a finding of bullying and harassment. And we also want to, when a concern is raised to us, fully investigate before coming to a conclusion. Our principals, our assistant principals, and soon our directors will have received extensive training on harassment and our expectations and our protocols. So anytime there's a concern, our principals, our assistant principals, and our directors need to be told so they can fully investigate and make a finding so that we have a record of looking into every concern that's raised. What we don't want to have happen is a parent raise a complaint to a teacher and a teacher feel like I've addressed it by talking directly to the student, and then we have no record when there's a second or a third incident. If there's any concerns that are raised, we want to make sure our principals and our assistant principals are involved and engaged and helping assist you to make sure that all of our students are safe and secure. I mentioned that we prohibit bullying and harassment, so let me define what both of those are. Harassment is a course of conduct which threatens, annoys, intimidates, alarms, or puts a person in fear for their safety. Harassment is unwanted, unwelcome, uninvited behavior that demeans, threatens, or offends the victim. Harassment is a higher level than bullying. It's more severe, ongoing, or pervasive. It may result in a hostile environment for the target or for bystanders. A hostile environment is one that interferes with a student's ability to participate in or benefit from services, activities, and learning. Or a hostile environment for an employee could be an environment that interferes with an employee's ability to participate in the work that it is that we need them to do. I mentioned bystanders because Sometimes students will be engaging in behavior that doesn't threaten either of the students who are exchanging inappropriate words or jokes or other things, but bystanders might think, I don't feel part of this community, or I feel unwelcome, or I feel like they are targeting me, even if they're not the party to the communication, which is one of the reasons why we want to fully investigate. Because if a teacher hears, say, two students interacting inappropriately, and they pass along to the principal, part of the principal's investigation or the assistant principal's investigation is going to be, who was a witness of this? Who was involved? Who might be impacted by this? So we can make sure that we have safe community for all of our students and all of our teachers. Some examples of harassment are derogatory comments or slurs, lewd proposition. Assault is a form of harassment. Standing in the way of someone moving or accessing a building or getting away is harassment. Offensive touching, physical interference with a normal school activity or a work or a movement, and visual insults such as derogatory posters or cartoons are all examples of harassment. Now, bullying. Bullying is aggressive and unwanted behavior that is intended to harm, intimidate, or humiliate the victim. It involves an imbalance of power between the aggressor and the victim. Sometimes it is a real imbalance of power. Sometimes it could just be a perceived imbalance of power. And it's repeated over time and causes severe emotional trauma. Bullying includes cyberbullying, but it doesn't include teasing, horseplay, argument, or peer conflict. This is a definition from the Virginia Code, and part of why we're focusing on the need to investigate any allegations of bullying is it's not until we ask the questions and determine what happened and who was there and who saw what and what was said that we can determine, was this ordinary teasing, or has this become pervasive, or is there an imbalance of power that would escalate this from the level of horseplay to actual bullying. Federal officials have said that schools can violate federal civil rights laws by failing to respond adequately to bullying and harassment allegations of students, of teachers, of staff members, of visitors. This relates directly to what I talked about earlier, our policies protecting students with disabilities and prohibiting discrimination and harassment on the basis of sex and sexual orientation, gender and gender identity. Failing to adequately respond can result in liability of a school division and personal liability if it rises to that level. So bullying must always be investigated and reported to your administrators and then reported back to parents that we looked into something. Parents should know what's going on with their students in schools. Also, sometimes what's reported as bullying might actually be harassment and arise to a higher level and require more intervention. So always make sure that there are reports of inappropriate behavior or poor interactions to your supervisor so they can fully investigate and say, this has actually happened in other contexts that you didn't know about that does make this rise to a higher level. We also have a policy, GBB, that prohibits abusive work environments, so that applies to our staff members. And we're promoting this because it's the right thing to do, and it's also important as we put together our model of having a caring community and culture. We want to make sure that our students, our parents, our staff feel welcome and are not bullied and are not harassed. Now moving on to professional ethics. This is for staff who interacts with students and is our expectation of you as employees of the school board. We have put you in a position where you have access to our students, where you work on a daily basis with our students. So these are our expectations for you in interacting with our students. Don't take an undue interest in a particular student. Don't have a special friend or a special relationship with a particular student or group of students. Don't favor certain students and give them special privileges. Don't invite students to come to the classroom at non-class times. Don't pull students from classes so that they can visit with you during your prep period. Don't engage in peer-like behavior with students. Signs that a teacher is using poor judgment in relation to a particular student include letting a student get away with inappropriate behavior, being alone with a student behind closed doors, giving gifts or money to a student, being overly touchy with certain students, or touching any student if there's not an educational or a health reason to do so. Other signs are giving students rides in educators' personal vehicles, especially alone, and having frequent communication, electronic or via the phone, with a particular student. We say this so that we know these are not things you should be doing with your students, but you also should be aware if your colleagues are doing it. If you see something, say something. This behavior is not acceptable and it will not be allowed. If you see it, let your supervisor know. Other signs that a teacher is becoming too involved in the private life of a student would be if an educator is talking about their personal life with a student. If a student's coming to an educator with their personal problems, when the educator is not in the role of counselor or of school psychologist, they shouldn't be the person that's the students come to person. If a student's coming to you with concerns, direct them to an administrator, direct them to a school counselor or school psychologist who is trained to support a student in that regard. We are grateful that our teachers care deeply about our students and are there to support students and build great professional relationships with students, but those relationships should always be professional. And if it starts to cross a line, or if a student is acting inappropriately or sharing inappropriate information with you that is not in your role to know that, it's our expectation that you direct the student to someone who can help them and can support them. Staff should not be extending contact with students beyond the school day, should not be taking students on outings, especially personal outings away from protective adults, and staff should never be using personal email, text messages, instant messages, DMs, or social networks to discuss personal topics with students or frankly with parents. Now we're getting to the end of the presentation. I have 3 more slides. Custody tips. Please be aware that the number here is 28%, but I think it's closer to 1/3 of students are living with only one parent, while the other parent lives elsewhere. This is important to know, both based on your expectation that maybe parents sign off on assignments or on report cards or know what's going on, but on emails and on carbon copies of emails, non-custodial parents still have a right to review the educational records of their student unless there's a court order that has terminated parental rights or a court order that has prohibited the sharing of educational information with parents. Sometimes there are contentious parental interactions where staff is still in the middle because staff has to communicate with both parents. So I would encourage you, if you have this kind of situation, talk to your administrator, talk to your principal. They can help you work through it. But we want to make sure that all parents have access to all of their educational records. So sometimes that'll mean letting both parents know that any email you receive from one parent will be copied to the other parent. So both parents can be in the loop and should be knowing, all parents should know what's going on with their students' education unless there's a court order terminating parental rights or limiting the sharing of educational information with a parent. So if you have questions, please do talk to your administrator. A few issues on school safety. We ask that you wear your badge at all times. Most folks on their badge have one of the lanyards. We do have green lanyards for staff who has received training on mental health first aid. We're hoping this year that as many staff want to receive training will receive training. This is part of our goal this year and always of keeping our students safe and making sure that if someone, staff member or student, is in a mental health crisis, we have individuals who have received training who are available to support the student or support the staff member. We also ask that visitors to buildings wear a badge or a sticker at all times. If you see an adult walking around a building who doesn't have on their FCCPS badge or isn't wearing a visitor sticker, stop them. Ask them, hi, can I help you? Who are you here to see? Do you need to check in at the main office to get a badge? Or call the main office and let them know. But sometimes individuals get access to our buildings when they haven't checked in the front office, and we want to make sure we know who is in our buildings at all times. So if you see something, say something. Stop someone, ask them a question, or reach out to Securitas, our security guards, to say, is this person allowed here? Should they be here? Another item that we wanted to touch on this year is electronic partitions. Only staff who is trained to operate electronic partitions may open and close electronic partitions. This is a new expectation that has been added to the Virginia Code. We only have 2 electronic partitions. They're both at Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School, and one is at the gym and one is in the cafetorium, but only staff who is trained to operate these may use them. Just as we're concerned about the physical safety of our buildings and folks who are walking around our buildings, we are concerned deeply about the social and emotional well-being of our students. If you have concerns about a student, if you think they need social and emotional support, refer them to the office, refer them to a school psychologist, refer them to a counselor, refer them to somebody with a green lanyard if you think a student is in crisis. Give a student a note to go to the main office to talk to someone. We conduct many threat assessments to make sure a student is safe and they're not in crisis or threatening to harm themselves or others. We always want to err on the side of providing emotional support to our students. School is very demanding. We ask a lot of our students, and we want to make sure that they are safe and they are secure, both in their physical building and in their mental health. So we want to make sure that we're there for our students and we're there for each other. We are better together, and it's our duty to be there for our students and for each other. That's all I've got for you. Thank you very much. I hope that you all have a wonderful school year. I look forward to being behind the scenes supporting you all. I look forward to the few times that I'm in schools interacting with you all. I hope it's a great year. Thank you for all that you do to support our students and our families and our community. Take care. Bye.